with this, I would like to start our conversation of today. Welcome everybody who's participating here on Zoom. Everybody who's joining us following this session through Facebook. You also have the chance to write comments and interact with us. This is Magdalena Kirchner. I'm the country director of the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation in Afghanistan. We work in this country since 2002 with our own office. And we, of course, invest most of our energy in capacity building institutions, but also personal capacities of young Afghans who try to improve the future of this country. And with this, I think I'm really happy to wish everyone here a good morning, good afternoon, good evening to Kabul, Brussels, and DC, where we have panelists and participants joining today to this discussion that for us is a very critical issue. The COVID pandemic, I think I'm not giving anyone in news, has been very critical also for our work in Afghanistan, but also for the Foundation's core mandate to address issues of social justice and sustainable development. With this paper that we want to present and discuss with you today in this report, we really wanted to look at also the second tier effects on the pandemic, on Afghanistan, because we see a much more attention is actually needed to the impact of COVID on both the capacity, the socioeconomic capacity that Afghanistan has when we want to talk about a peace. We want to look at the institutions and the foundation for that peace that can be found and can be maintained. And we think that's critical to have a deeper look. What is actually the damage or the impact behind the health crisis? And I'm really, really happy that Saad Parto and Lucille Martin from the Afghanistan Public Policy Research Organizations have joined us in this effort and will present their wonderful paper. You have seen the executive summary. We just today also published the local language versions of this, and the final report will be published in the next 24 hours. But for us, of course, this is not only a local discussion, it's also an international discussion. Everybody who's watching here today knows that COVID has certainly also had an impact on the countries on the other side, if I can call it like this. The international community is affected by COVID in equal terms as Afghanistan, and this has a profound impact on the relations between Afghanistan and the outside world. We talk about borders, or if we talk about international support, there is a COVID factor in everything that 2020 touches, and that is something that we also want to discuss here. So I'm really pleased that we have Burt with us from USIP, who also had recently published a paper that looked exactly on the political, economical impact of the crisis. And when we look towards the next weeks and the Geneva conference coming up, I think everybody knows that here are big questions, both on the priorities in future support and also the adjustments that have to be made and what's actually possible. And last but not least, we of course want to bring this home in discussing directly with Afghan decision makers about how this actually can be implemented and what are the expectations from Afghanistan to the donors to make sure that if there is a peace agreement, it will find a friendly environment. And with this, I'm really excited that we have Mohammed Muybe with us from the Ministry of Finance, the senior advisor to the Deputy Minister of Finance. Really warm welcome to all of you. And I will now give over to our wonderful moderator, Timur Sharma, who kindly volunteered to bring all these questions together. I'm really looking forward to this. Again, thank you all for participating, for producing this train of thought and discussing with us. Without any further ado, over to you, Timur, and thank you everyone for joining today.
Thank you so much, Magdalena. Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to all of you. This is Timur Sharma. I'm at the moment working at AUF as an adjunct professor. Formerly, I was at Independent Director of Local Governance as a Deputy Minister for Program and Policy. and International Crisis Group Senior Policy Analyst for Afghanistan. It's my pleasure to moderate this session. This is an important work. It's a comprehensive report on the impact of COVID-19 on social, economic, and political conditions on the ground in Afghanistan. It covers a wide range of issues, including social cohesion and justice, gender-based violence, peace process, marginalized and vulnerable communities, including returnees. It's timely because there is ongoing discussion around the Geneva Conference and commitment of international donors and how financial crises in these countries are going to impact their commitment for the next couple of years. And whether we are going to see some sort of, this is going to exacerbate pre-existing Afghan fatigue given that Afghanistan has been a major issue for international donors over the 18 years. I'm quite excited because the paper not only discusses challenges, but it also points out that COVID-19 raises a unique opportunity for devising new approaches and tools to development and humanitarian aid in Afghanistan. I'm very pleased that FES has commissioned this report, and APRO, one of the best think tanks in Afghanistan that I have been quite impressed with, has produced this report. So let me quickly introduce my panelists. Mr. Nik Mohammed Muybe is currently serving as a senior advisor to the Deputy Minister for Finance. And prior to this, he has worked as a director of large taxpayer office at the Ministry of Finance. Mr. Muybe is a long-standing servant of Ministry of Finance, certainly an accomplishment given how politicized some of our ministries have become. And he holds a master's degree in business administration from AUAF, specializes in public financial management, corporate finance, and so forth. Ms. Muybe has had various international financial, has worked for various international financial institutions. He has managed multi-year funding, $1.6 billion portfolio for ADB. Quite an accomplishment, and I'm very proud to introduce him as my fellow Afghans. My second panelist is William Burt. He's now the senior expert on Afghanistan. He has been working with USAIP since 2012. Mr. Burt has a master's degree from Harvard University, and he has worked quite a long time for the World Bank. He was stationed in Afghanistan from 2002 to 2006 as World Bank's country manager for Afghanistan. And very briefly on the authors, Mr. Saeed Parto, a good friend of mine, is co-author and director of research at Afghanistan Public Policy Research Organizations. He's been working, he has over 25 years of work experience in academia and also in development field. His PhD, he's obtained his PhD in human geography from University of Waterloo in Canada. And he has remained a very good friend of Afghanistan over the years. Quickly, Ms. Lucy Lee Martin has a PhD in conflict and has and member of conflict research group of the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences at Ghent University in Belgium. She has worked as a research program manager with APRO over the years and currently based in Brussels. Very quickly on some of the house rules. This is a panel discussion. I'm afraid participants cannot speak in this panel, but they can write down their comments and suggestions in the message or chat area. This is broadcasted live on Facebook. And please, if you're not speaking, unmute your mic. Let's start with the presentation first. So the floor is yours, Mr. Parto. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Timur, Magdalena, and everyone, and welcome. And thank you for this opportunity for us as an organization, but also as researchers to share with you what we found in this very broad and ambitious study commissioned by FES. I will now have to share my screen, which should be there. Can everyone see it? Good.
Yes.
Okay, so the title implies that we are on shaky grounds, and what we have attempted to do is to find the different aspects of this shakiness by looking at a broad range of areas. The rationale for doing this was to have a rather systemic approach by taking into account the legacies of the current conflict, which goes back to at least 40 years. To accommodate what has been done as far as the peacemaking in Afghanistan and the peace process which is currently underway. And on top of that, to see how COVID-19 as a new phenomenon has an impact in these conditions on social, economic, and political processes. The objective, therefore, was to examine the implications of these interrelated factors on the longer-term prospects for sustainable peace in Afghanistan. Bearing in mind that if peace is to be sustainable, it has to address a whole range of issues, including rights and the needs of ordinary people and societal priorities within Afghanistan. The second part of the objective was to examine the implications of the interrelated factors on the success or failures in creating conditions to restore confidence in the economy and in the social, economic, and political institutions, and see if there is any way that incentives for continued or recurrence of the conflict after a peace agreement could be prevented. Under the same sort of series of points in the examination, we also wanted to explore how international assistance might look beyond 2020. And we thought we'd do all of this in order to initiate a dialogue with a fresh breath of air to address a series of very fundamental questions as far as what the country, such as Afghanistan, needs under the current circumstances. The key findings, if you have seen the brief that has been released and also the report that will come out, are grouped under 8 categories. We look at the economic impacts, we look at gender dynamics under COVID-19, we look at social cohesion, we look at the operating conditions for NGOs, we look at more broadly state civil society relations beyond COVID-19. We make a point of stating that Afghanistan's economy really still remains very much a war economy, and the elements that constitute such an economy. How COVID-19 and whether and how COVID-19 has affected or will affect the intra-Afghan peace dialogue, and what modalities would be possible post-COVID-19 when that eventually comes, post-Geneva, despite the conflict and after peace, and if there isn't a peace agreement to be reached. As far as the economic impacts of immediate economic impacts of COVID-19, I think everybody would agree that there has been a significant loss of livelihoods. There has been an abnormal inflation as far as the prices of basic foods. Even a couple of weeks into the situation, people were stockpiling flour and beans and oil and things like that, and the prices were going through the roof. On the government side, there was reduced base for domestic revenue to be generated, and the dependency on international aid to sustain the Afghan state increased as one of the immediate outcomes of COVID-19. More broadly, at the macro level, non-agricultural economic indicators contracted in the first half of 2020. This is based on World Bank data. And reduced global economic activity had implications internally, domestically, combined with structural deficiencies of the Afghan economy and its economic institutions. At a more micro level, significant losses in jobs, particularly in very, very small businesses, micro businesses, NGOs losing revenue that was expected but didn't come because activities were ceased to operate. and among a vast majority of workers who earn their living on a daily basis, the day laborers that congregate in different places in urban areas like Kabul to find a day job. Coupled with that is the endemic rent-seeking behavior, which is now fully systemic in Afghanistan, and the expected and actual misappropriation of the earmarked assistance to deal with COVID-19. Community networks were heavily strained because of the hardship related to the pandemic. And one of the implications of that is that if you don't have community support, if you're not supported by your own kin and family group, you look elsewhere for assistance, and sometimes that assistance comes from unsavory sources. There is, however, some evidence of resilience, particularly in traditional industry, and also within some segments of the community. Through social media, for example, there are groups that attempt to attend to targeted communities' needs. I mentioned the war economy, and this has to be caveated by saying that although there has been significant improvements in human capital development and macroeconomic management, that the economy remains largely as what could be best characterized as a war economy. There is institutionalized rent seeking, that is, nobody does anything for anyone unless there is a payoff involved somewhere. This functions very, very effectively through kleptocratic and nepotistic networks and parallel structures of governance, and that includes structures that armed opposition groups set up to collect taxes, for example, or levies on trucks moving on highways. There's also, in addition to that, illicit economic activity in drugs, in kidnappings, in ransom seeking, in all types of illegal areas. For those who profit from the war, the continuation of the conflict is economically more profitable than political stability. And without a clear prospect for licit and stable sources of income to replace the livelihoods, significant livelihoods that come from the continuation of the armed conflicts, narcotics, and a wide range of other activities, we have to think about how the current economy will be able to reintegrate the ex-fighters of the Taliban if peace comes and if we are going to look at this issue of reintegration. Gender dynamics, as always, as in all situations, tell us, if we do a gender analysis, that women experience the current situation differently from men. They are the primary caregivers in households, and as a result of that, they are most exposed to risks of contamination within the domestic environment. The emergency measures that have been taken so far, and actually I have not seen this outside of Afghanistan either, there are no specific provisions for women's specific needs under COVID conditions. In Afghanistan, this means access, for example, to shelters if there is a increase in violence because of people being confined or being out of work or just being angry at the situation. These elements have not been part of the intervention to address COVID-19. Women's organizations with mandates to provide social support to women and children report that their activities have been interrupted because of the pandemic pressures, and also because, and I get to this later, because their areas of activity are based on activity-based budgeting. And if there is no activity, then there is no budget, and therefore there is no continued service. As far as social cohesion, it appears that the networks of support, as I mentioned earlier, remain pretty much intact, although under a lot of stress. In urban centers, there have been new forms of mobilization through social media in response to the pandemic, but this is very, very sparse. At a higher level, there is a lack of trust in formal institutions of governance. There is a general lack of or attempt at accountability by officials regarding the management of the earmarked funds to deal with COVID-19. the people that we have talked to, not only for this paper, but also in other research we have done on COVID and other things relating to government functions serving the civilians, is that government officials are perceived as being concerned more about reporting to international donors to ensure the inward flow of funds rather than providing service to their constituents. The already weak trust in the government's ability and legitimacy has actually been exacerbated due to at least allegations of misappropriation of the resources that were intended to address the COVID-19 situation.
Mr. Parto, I'm afraid we have only 3 more minutes.
All right. Similarly, NGOs have been affected because their operation is very activity-based and budget is only released if activities are to continue. As far as peace negotiations, there are some things to consider that while the US itself grapples with the pandemic-related domestic issues and political crises which continue as we speak right now, how this will have a bearing on the peace negotiations that are taking place at the moment about Afghanistan. A sudden withdrawal of the troops for political or other reasons is something that needs to be addressed and thought about by international donors. And little is said that we can ascertain about what other international donors will do if the US suddenly decides to withdraw from Afghanistan. Rather than giving you a conclusion, I want to use the last 2 minutes to just raise the questions that we would really like everyone to think about and attempt to answer, is that, that despite the persistence of corruption, institutionalized patriarchal arrangement, and social fragmentation, how can international aid better address the needs of the Afghan citizens in their diversity through the interventions that will be coming to Afghanistan for COVID-19? And despite the persistence of all these factors, how can international aid better address the needs of the Afghans in the peace process? And specifically, interventions relating to COVID-19 and the peace process, what combination from on-budget funding, from off-budget funding, through multilateral mechanisms such as ARTF, or direct funding for non-government organizations, what sort of combination can we employ to work there? The last slide is on the medium-term questions. How would a peace agreement affect the modalities of international aid provision for Afghanistan, specifically if there is a peace agreement, and specifically if there is no peace agreement? And beyond Geneva conference in a few days, what thought has been given about the modalities of aid being provided to Afghanistan? And in the longer term, how can relations between stakeholders in development be more efficient and effective through better information sharing, coordination, cooperation, and collaboration? We know that we all talk about these things as being important. We know that despite knowing that these are important, we do not do anything to strengthen these 4 elements of sharing, coordination, cooperation, and collaboration. What could we do differently given the opportunities that the new crisis have presented us with? And what can be done to shift the focus from upward functional accountability, which is to report to donors and people who give us the money, to downward accountability and strategic accountability to the people who are to benefit from the aid that's being provided? And I think that's it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mr. Parto. A lot of interesting questions, and certainly your presentation goes beyond the specific issue of COVID and how that impacts Afghanistan. Let's quickly move on to Mr. Burt. You have 10 minutes. Colleagues who have joined us, if you have any questions and comments to make, please write them in the chat and we'll then present it to our panelists. Mr. Burt, the floor is yours.
Luckily, although I'm an economist, I just remembered to unmute my my machine, which is great progress, because usually I go the first minute or 2 with muted, and then people have to frantically warn me. Thanks very much to FES and to Dr. Kirshner for inviting me to this event to discuss the important topic that is being covered. And also to the authors for an excellent report and presentation just given now. Obviously, the report is a very useful, in-depth study providing rich analysis and food for thought. I agree with most of the findings, these which are broadly consistent with my own much more limited research on the political economy repercussions of COVID for Afghanistan. And though the comprehensiveness, depth, and detail of the FES report far exceeds that of my work, I do feel it is in some ways complementary to my short paper on the subject that was published by the Afghanistan Analyst Network. In particular, the report's focus is on crucial areas of governance, accountability, civil society, and social issues, as well as the peace process, which, as the moderator pointed out, goes well beyond the COVID issue, as well, and also, frankly, more general aid issues, which are the same. My work, and which I'll talk about, I guess, a bit, is more emphasizing the macroeconomic, fiscal, and in particular the aid implications of COVID. Another complementarity, I think, is that you do take a medium to long-term perspective in the report, which, as a former World Bank staff, of course, and a development economist, that is very right. I've become much more of a political economist and a short-term person after I left the World Bank, so my paper looks at the short-term issues more. I think what both the report and my paper have in common is that we both had to wrestle with the challenge of trying to come up with meaningful, practical recommendations that have a realistic chance of improving the situation, which is already quite problematic and further compounded by COVID. So the report's concluding sections do include some generic points and then a series of questions, but not very much in the way of specificity. And I realize, of course, however, that the intention of the report may have been to generate a results-oriented dialogue rather than to put forward hard and fast recommendations. For my paper, I tried to keep the recommendations down to earth and practical, but struggled to find any actions which I thought realistically would improve the situation in a significant way. So while making specific suggestions, I had to acknowledge openly in the paper that I didn't think my recommendations, either individually or as a whole, would actually result in substantial improvements in the situations. Let me briefly add a few thoughts about how all this relates to the Geneva conference that will be held later this month. First, as I've emphasized in my paper, the international donors have gone out of their way to mobilize and allocate aid to COVID response, even if most of that is actually from diversion and shifting of existing resources. However, this is likely to aggravate the aid squeeze, which may be apparent at Geneva. Though understandable, in retrospect, it may turn out to have been a mistake to shift so much aid to COVID response when this could not be backed up by continuation of even normal levels of aid next year, let alone more aid for COVID. Already, we are seeing press reports that, unlike in past international donor conferences for Afghanistan, the norm this time will be one-year aid pledges, even though there will be the usual 4-year development framework. Moreover, it's being reported in the press that there may be a significant decline in the level of aid pledged overall. So even, nothing more for COVID, but even less of existing aid. Such developments would be unfortunate. And second and related, the sustainability of COVID response aid beyond 2020 is greatly in doubt in view of this deterioration in the overall aid picture and the borrowing, what I've called borrowing in the paper of some future aid to generate a larger aid response to COVID this year. But as we know, there are likely to be at least lingering effects, if not major effects from COVID next year and associated needs, which donors may not be well placed to address. Finally, and this is obvious to all people who knows Afghanistan, but just to emphasize, and certainly I need to keep emphasizing it here in the US, while COVID itself would be more than a sufficiently daunting challenge for a country like Afghanistan, as we know, it is unfortunately just one of a number of extremely difficult problems the country faces. And I would argue not the worst one. Moreover, and this is where I think I take a different line from the paper, from the report, FES report, beyond the admittedly impressive but ultimately unsustainable one-time allocation of aid for COVID response, I do not see any evidence that some silver lining opportunities that may be associated with the pandemic are being exploited. Just to give one example, unlike in some other countries, but unfortunately much like in other countries, including arguably my own, the COVID has unfortunately not led to greater national cohesion in Afghanistan, not to bridging the political divisions among the non-Taliban elites, nor between the Republican and Taliban sides. There's no ceasefire, not a real reduction in violence, nor any significant progress in the current peace talks, nor, I would argue, signs of a real quote unquote national unity government on the non-Taliban side. This is not to say that the pandemic is responsible for, nor necessarily has aggravated, the deep, long-standing political, security, and other problems Afghanistan faces. Although the paper does rightly point out some of the impacts, for example, on social problems such as gender violence, which is also happening in other countries. But I just would like to underline again that I think the opportunity for transforming the COVID crisis into an opportunity has been missed. And with the concerning information that is beginning to come out about Geneva conference, it does not seem this picture will change very much. Excuse me. I wish I could strike a more optimistic tone and would be more than happy if my pessimism turns out to be overblown. But unfortunately, I do not see that happening. Thanks again, and looking forward to a lively, productive discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mr. Burt. A very interesting analysis and a very thorough review of the paper. I'll come back to the authors to respond to some of your observations, which I found quite interesting. Some of them are quite different. Let's move on to Mr. Muhammad Muybe. Please, the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to be here. The COVID-19 was hit the Afghanistan, and it had a very difficult situation, especially in the macroeconomic point of view, because the GDP growth, which was last year 3 to 4%, but this was like contracted by 5%. At the same time, this also impacted our revenue collection, and our target was like 208 billion AFs, and it was reduced by 16% from one side. In the other side, there was also additional cost of the health sector to fight against the COVID-19, to build new facilities for the health and also the equipment for the hospitals. So this was also like additional burden of 21 billion AFs on the government. So totally, like from finance point of view, 56 billion of financial pressure was on the government. So with the support of the development partner, we were able to manage this in a way to also cover those health costs and also to operate the normal government activities. And beside of that, this COVID-19 also had very bad and adverse social and economical impact on the people. And just to fight those things, we also work with the development partner, especially with the World Bank and the ARTIP donors. And we came up with a package of $280 million that will be distributed like the essential food material in all 34 provinces in the rural and also in the cities area. And it will be implemented by 3 agencies: Ministry of Rural Rehabilitation, Kabul Municipality, and IDLG. And the same time, the food shortage, which was due to the border closure. So this was like for a month time. So we were able to manage this through our custom and also through our alternative routes. And that was also, currently we can say like the inflation rate is also normal. So that 1 month was very peak time. So just in the health sector specifically, there was a $109 million direct support from the World Bank and the ARTF resources for the health sector, and also $40 million from the ADB to construct those facilities and also equip the health facilities. And for this shortage of revenue and also additional health costs, we also get support from the World Bank, additional $200 million as on budget support, plus $100 million from the ADB and also from the rapid credit facility of the IMF. So this was very helpful. So currently in this year, from macroeconomic point of view, we are in a good situation, and we don't have any difficult or challenging situation in terms of the financial resources to those things. At the same time, we are also in the preparation stage for the Geneva conference that we developed the NPDA, that the main focus was on the state building, market building and peace building. And we are very hopeful that if the peace comes, it will have very direct impact on the development of the country. Because the services will be delivered to those areas that currently the government cannot reach to those areas, or we can say the hard reach area. And also it will reduce the security costs of the development projects. And we will be able to implement our development programs all over the country. In the terms of the market building, the government focuses on the private sector lead economy. And we are trying to work inside the government to digitalize all the processes, especially in the revenue collection and also the public spending, that it will help the government of Afghanistan to attract foreign direct investment that currently we are facing with the challenges. And also it will improve the Afghanistan ranking in the doing business indicator of the World Bank report. The question which was raised by colleagues about this accountability and transparency, those donor aid which came through government, or we can say through own budget, there is a accountability mechanism, and we also agreed with the IMF as one of the benchmark with the new ECA program, which will be for the coming 3.5 years, that the COVID-19 spending will be investigated by the Supreme Audit Office, and they will release their report and their findings, and it will be available to public through their website by June 2021. And also at the moment, the Ombudsperson Office of the President is also working on those things, those allegations which are there. They are investigating those issues, and their finding will be also shared with the public. In terms of the on budget and off budget, so if we look to the data, the local impact of the aid which were through on budget, that was much higher than the off budget, and currently we are like 49% of the donors aid are coming through on budget, and we expect that it will increase in the coming 4 years. And we have a few mechanisms that how to bring the donor is through on budget. So we have 4 trust funds. So ART, Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund, we have Afghanistan Infrastructure Trust Fund, we have the LUTFA, and also the ANA Trust Fund. All these funds are managed by the development partners like World Bank, ADB, UNDP, and also NATO forces. So there is a mechanism of accountability that a single penny that you're paying to government. So there is accountability, and we are accountable for those things. And there was a concern with the ARTF donors recently that some of their money was not spent in the right place, and also like it didn't follow the agreed procedures that we have had with the World Bank. So that is why we agreed with them to hire the third party to do the fiduciary review of one of our projects, which we are calling NHLP, which is one of the huge projects that we have. So their finding was very well taken by the government, and all those amount of money that they thought that that were ineligible expenditure, which not followed their procedures. So we paid that money back to the awarding. So this mechanism of accountability is there, and the government focus is currently how to change the traditional economy to the digital economy, and how to change the import economy to the export economy. For that purpose, with the ART upcoming strategy, which is for 4 years from 21 to 25, the main focus will be on the agriculture sector, that currently around 40% of our labor are busy there. And also the second focus will be on the extractive industries, just how to increase our export to come up to reduce the gap between import and export. And also in the agriculture sector, how to build the new irrigation facilities to on-farm water, and also how to industrialize the agriculture sector from the mechanized agriculture sector. These are the main focus that we are doing on those things.
Mr. Muybe, you have only 2 minutes, I'm afraid.
Okay. And also, many Afghans lost their job that they were working in the private sectors. So recently, the cabinet, the High Economic Council approved a package of around $300 million to support the MSME, micro, small, and medium enterprises. So these are the action that government taking. In terms of the accountability, we are trying to be accountable for each penny that you are receiving for the donor. So all the mechanism and the procedure that they have, you are following all those things. Thank you very much. So if there is any specific questions, so then I will be happy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Muybe. I have a quick question for you just to broaden this conversation. As Mr. Burt was saying, that allocating aid to respond to COVID-19 led to aid squeeze, and that was a mistake. First, would you agree to that? What is government doing on that? Secondly, what the Afghan government has proposed in terms of ANDFP is from 2021 to 2025, whereas the actual donor commitment is going to be only, it seems to be for 1 year. Just very quickly from you on that, given how important Geneva is for Afghanistan.
So at the moment, we don't think this will be for 1 year, because still we are in discussion, and also then PDF was shared with all the development partners. So our expectation is for 4 years, but we don't know exactly that how much money will be allocated and how much commitment will be there. So our expectation is for 4 years. So let's see that what is happening. So we are optimistic to the Geneva conference.
And do you think allocating significant amount of aid money to COVID-19 was a mistake from the Afghan government side?
No, I don't think, because if you look to the casualties that we have from the COVID-19 compared to other countries, this is very least. So the reason is that we had generous support from the donors community to fight against those things. This is one. Just to add one other sentence. If you look that we have the self-reliance paper, and our approach is that by 2025, all the operating costs will be financed by the government of Afghanistan. Then there will be no need for the donors community to support us in the operating costs. The only support of them through loan or through grant will be for the development purposes. So I think that is very good benchmark that we have, that we agreed with the development partners, and we are working for those things. So just yesterday, the budget of the new year 2021 was endorsed by the cabinet of ministers, that today we sent to the parliament. So like our target was $216 billion for the revenue collection, and this is a good step toward the self-realization, self-reliance, and we expect that by 2025 we will be able to have 400 billion revenue, which is enough for our operating costs. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll come to the authors next, but I want Mr. Burt to respond to my Afghan colleagues' answer.
Sorry, which answer? I think you raised two questions.
Both of those questions very quickly.
Okay, yeah. Well, look, my paper showed a COVID response aid, labeled COVID response aid of about $1.5 billion, which is a very impressive total, although probably 80%, on the order of 80% of it is actually existing money that's being repurposed and labeled as COVID response. So the amount of new aid was much more limited, basically 100 million from the World Bank and 220 million from IMF, which is credit, not grant, and maybe a few other items too. For example, I couldn't go into the depths and look at the EU and German response, whether it was entirely new money. I suspect some of it was. But the basic point is the bulk of it is shifting other aid to COVID response. And within that, a very large number, I'd have to look right at my paper again, sorry, to say how much, but a lot of it was to cover the fiscal hole of it, which, Germany and the United States, when you have COVID, the US has already put several $1 trillion in, and that can be funded by borrowing, and the markets take it. And I'm sure the same is true in Europe and Germany and elsewhere. For Afghanistan, that's not possible. They just cannot borrow that much. So when the revenue, as the previous presenter said, talked about the revenue implications of COVID, those are very real. And if aid had not plugged that gap, then that would have caused real problems for the government in terms of maintaining functionality. So when I use the word mistake, it was too strong. But what's the use of, to be a bit provocative, what's the use of putting out $1.5 billion of COVID aid? First, if most of it is from other aid, diversion of other aid. Secondly, it's not going to be maintained in coming years. And probably a couple of $100 million, it's hard to know exactly, but some of it is coming from next year's aid allocation. So that means next year the aid will be less unless it's made up by additional aid by other donors. But I would again put this in the context of what I mentioned, what I'm seeing from public reporting on Geneva, that the aid pledges will be for 1 year and will be less. I mean, that's public reporting, which, as I've not found a clear denial of that among donors. Maybe the German government has a different view, and I know some European countries may well pledge for 4 years, but I think that the norm for the conference will be 1 year pledges, 4-year framework, and God forbid a review every year, which will further strengthen what I think the paper called this upward accountability.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. Let me give the floor to Mr. Parto and Ms. Lucille to respond to some of the differences that was highlighted by Mr. Burt. And then I have 3 questions from Mr. Hakimi, Ali Amani, and another colleague. So Mr. Parto, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. The point about what Bill said about whether it's an opportunity or not, we have a small project that's looking at how COVID-19 budget has been allocated and being spent in 3 provinces in eastern Afghanistan, in Nangarhar, Kunar, and Laghman. And of the small amounts that have been sent to those provinces, there's still a significant amount that's unspent. This is in no way unique to COVID-19 budget. It applies to all the budgeting that is prepared by the government of Afghanistan and then not fully allocated, which speaks to deficiencies in administration, at least, if not other issues. In the decision-making about how to allocate the money that's given to these authorities, provincial authorities, civil society is almost fully absent. They may be there as observers, but they're not participants with voice, and their voice, if they have any, is not responded to. And the government is viewed as largely unaccountable about what it does with the money that's been earmarked through pulling from other resources, other aid money to attend to COVID-19 situation. Is it an opportunity? In some ways, yes. As always, our answer to a question like that is, what happens if you give a bigger role to civil society? And we don't just mean give them money, involve them in decision making, and truly create a situation of mutual accountability of government to its citizens and its organizations. Don't just talk to 5 NGOs that are your favorites. Define mechanisms, put in place mechanisms that would bring in the input that is very much needed from civil society side. On the question of what Mr. Muybe raised about accountability to the donors and the money being returned, we know this happens. This is part of the problem. How does the government of Afghanistan account to its citizens about what it is doing with its money and to what effect? What are the mechanisms that need to be in place to account for this strategically and to the people that it's supposed to serve? That is the question, not whether or not you report back to the donors. We know that's what they focus on. What do we want to focus on is the question.
Ms. Lucille, you have anything to add? You're muted.
Sorry. No, just concerning the term opportunity. I mean, I think we agree that it's a very difficult time. And I think by the term opportunity, we also meant to stress maybe the urgency of changing the mindset of how aid modalities are thought and have been implemented in Afghanistan in the past 20 years. And something that struck us as we were actually conducting the literature review for the paper is we came across a paper written in 2001, actually published in 2001 and written before the change of regime, that was also issuing recommendations to donors that were very similar to the type of recommendations we would be doing now. And that struck us as something that is, well, first of all, shocking, but in a way quite appalling to see that recommendations that about more coordination, about more downward accountability had been formulated before and obviously had fallen on deaf ears. So the opportunity provided by COVID-19 is more that all of a sudden, since everything was a bit shaken, it kind of provided a time to rethink the fact that it comes at a moment where Afghanistan is at crossroads with the kind of peace process taking shape, and the withdrawal of the American forces, which creates a lot of anxieties, was also elements that kind of convinced us that these are questions that have to be addressed now. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. There was a question, so let me ask you that question from Mr. Rahmatullah Hakimi on the methodology. He was basically asking for you to elaborate on the methodology and what quality control methods you were using to increase reliability. I think this is, as one of the students of, I think he's a student at AUF, and that's an important question, I think.
Right. Well, we did a very comprehensive literature review as a start, and there was already, at least on the economic side, a lot of data available from the World Bank. This paper did not ambition to be like a full research paper relying on survey data, quantitative and qualitative data. So it was focused like primarily on the literature review, and then with interviews that kind of supplemented the literature review to understand from the actors themselves what their perspectives were on the changes that were ongoing. And the stakeholders we interviewed were from the donor community. So let's say representatives of international governments, representatives of international NGOs, and agencies of governments working in Afghanistan. And then we also interviewed Afghan NGOs in Afghanistan and members of the private sector to kind of get, and members of civil society, like individuals who are not necessarily tied to an NGO, but which are active members of civil society. And this was to get a sense of kind of what we were seeing in the literature that was issued from data from the World Bank, but also from UN agencies that were issuing regular reports at the time, matched or contradicted the experiences of people who were working in Afghanistan and their views on different aspects that we address in the report.
Thank you. The second question for both of you is, has the researchers of the paper, yourself, can you shed light on the impact of COVID-19 on the most vulnerable groups in Afghanistan, including religious minorities, Sikhs, Hindus, and IDPs? I think you do discuss this in your report, but maybe this is an opportunity to elaborate on that for us.
Said, do you want to take it or? No, okay. We don't address religious minorities in the report. Unfortunately, we couldn't address everything. Concerning IDPs, well, there are several aspects, of course, of the impact of COVID-19, depending if you look at what we would call, let's say, the health impact or the sanitary impact of the crisis. Which is not just limited to IDPs, but just generally people living in the urban poor, let's say, living in crowded urban settings, for which having social distancing measures was literally impossible. That combined with limited access to health facilities that provide just even minimal care and just basic hygiene is an issue. The second problem that would be related to displacement is if the economic consequences of the pandemic amplify, it is likely to create more displacement. I'm not sure if that addresses the question.
Okay, well, thank you so much for this. So I have there's a question for Mr. Muybe here from an anonymous attendee. The question is, what procedures are in place to monitor that the fundings are spent well by the Afghan government and it's not wasted? At the beginning of the pandemic, we received reports of high level of corruption. Money were wasted. And I attended yesterday a panel participated by some of our international donors. And the question that they were raising was that in addition to the COVID, it seems to be at the Geneva conference, this question of whether Afghan government has performed in terms of its commitment that it made in 2018 Geneva conference, including fighting corruption, securing free elections, and so forth. If my notes are correct, 63 commitments were made in 2018 Geneva conference, 27 has been achieved, 25 is remaining, and the rest has not been achieved. And that raises question about government performance. So Mr. Muybe, could you talk to that question, please, for us?
Sure. I think this is a very valid question, and there is a concern as some of the report which was published by the media. That is why when we were designing our program with the IMF for the next 3.5 years, this was one of their benchmarks, that all the COVID-19 spending has to be investigated, that where, how, through which mechanism it has been spent. And the report will be available to the public. In addition to that, the ombudsperson is also investigating this issue. There are two things of accountability. One is accountability to the donor community. The other is accountability to the Afghan people and the Afghan authorities. So for the Afghan people, we are reaching to the end of the fiscal year, and all the money which has been spent, the report will be prepared and it will be shared with the parliament and also with the public as well. So if you see that currently in the parliament, there is discussion on the last year expenditure report, that single item which was found by the Supreme Audit Office, that is under discussion, and also their recommendation is currently we are working. So, and in terms of the concern of the people, so the money which has been spent through on budget, we are totally accountable, and we will make sure that every money where has been spent, the information will be available to all. But the money which was spent through off budget, we are not sure exactly, but there should be like the joint responsibility, the donors and also the government institution, that they spend those money, both of those should be responsible from. But from Minister of Finance side, from the on-budget, we are totally responsible, and we will make sure and the finding will be shared when it is finalized, because still this is in investigation stage. I cannot say anything because the report is not finalized. Whenever the report is finalized, it will be shared with all. About the GMAP accountability, so we are working on the third quarter progress report, and I'm sure most of those commitment which is in progress, those will be completed. But if you look to the breakdown, that the commitment which was made by the donors community and also by the government, because this is mutual accountability framework, the progress of the government is much higher than the donors community. So there is delay. I agree with that one, but the delay is not that much as with the donor community. So it means both sides are responsible to that one. Just to add one other things, that previously the question was raised that the money was spent by the government authorities, there was nothing for the civil society. So if you look, still we have 49% aid spending through on budget, but the 51% is still remaining for the UN, international NGOs and local NGOs and civil society. So there is still a big portion for the civil society. So this is not the case that everything has been spent by the government one. And accountability, as I mentioned before, we have two kinds of accountability to the donors community. We agree with them based on their own procedure that like for the ARTF, the World Bank procedures, the World Bank guideline is taken care of. And also in the infrastructure trust fund is the ADB guideline, and also for the load for UNDP. So we agree with their own procedure, and we are accountable to follow those things. So this is mutual accountability. That is why we are telling them that on-budget is a good mechanism. And about the decision making that you mentioned, that everything has been spent by the government and the people is not involved in the decision making. Just let me give you an example. That yesterday the budget was endorsed by the cabinet, so the information is publicly available. But before that, the senior management of Ministry of Finance traveled to 17 provinces, and there was consultation meeting with the civil society, with the provincial council, with the local authorities, because previously the allegation was that every decision is making in the capital in Kabul, not in provinces. So we went to the 17 provinces and to the deputy minister level and DG budget level, and we took their opinion that what are their need, and based on our availability of the resources, because the need is much higher than the availability of resources, but we consider all those things. In addition to that, in this new year budget, 3 billion apps was allocated to only to the provinces, that the projects, development projects, and the priority should be selected by the provincial council, civil society, and the provincial development committee. So the decision is also there. Thank you.
Well, thank you for this. I really hope that is the case, because when President Ghani came to power, the commitment was that 40% of development plans, 40% of the budget would be allocated to the provinces through the development planning process. And when I was at IDLG, that never unfortunately materialized, and we failed to some extent in terms of including the needs and priorities of local people into account and including them into the budget process, partly because the budgeting system in Afghanistan is quite centralized. The planning and budgeting and the planning system in Afghanistan. I do have a very interesting question from Christine here, and that question is for Mr. Burt and Mr. Muybe. She asked if you could elaborate a little further about concrete scenarios for Afghanistan in the next years, seeing that there may be significantly less funds available due to the double challenge, the smaller Geneva pledges, COVID, and so forth. Which areas might be affected? Thank you. So, Mr. Burt, if you could respond to that question.
Well, scenario development is there. I think, it partly depends how much aid is declining and what is prioritized. Let me give you an example. The Afghan budget's discretionary development program has some good projects, perhaps, but it also has some projects that are geared to parliamentarians in order to win either ministry confirmations or other things. So there may be some room in the discretionary development budget to preserve the better projects and take out those. That's a very small example. Look, I mean, we can pay attention to all the different pieces of the puzzle, but if the puzzle is falling apart, it doesn't really matter. And you know, what does it matter if the government on paper fulfilled, you know, 39 of the 60 or whatever Geneva 2018 Geneva commitments made by the government? And what does it matter if the donors didn't fulfill them? Are the donors going to be accountable and therefore provide more aid to make up whatever the deficit is? The answer is no. And I guess one related point, although it's one point I've been wanting to make that that may not be directly related, but you know, the point one of the authors made about the 2001 papers. Well, you know, I've been full-time on Afghanistan basically since October 2001 and also earlier. And these issues about how to improve aid and all that have been there basically since 2001, if not, and also earlier. Yeah, in fact, there's a World Bank paper from the 1970s, which one could go back and look at in terms of Afghanistan's development. So, you know, this and my concern about Geneva, quite frankly, is in response to, you know, whatever it is, government performance problems or other problems and the situation with the peace process, the response looks like it may be more of the same, i.e. more targets, more pressure on the government instead of bi-yearly meetings, annual meetings. And I think the report makes a good point about upward accountability. So, you know, my last point, and I'm sorry, I'm taking up points not directly related to the question, but, you know, I just want to highlight that, you know, I don't think donors can substitute for civil society. That's very clear. I would also argue, though, that even more, I don't think donors can substitute for an effective and functioning Afghan government. And I think that's probably, you know, civil society has developed a good bit. I'm not, you know, I don't follow it all that closely and may face many problems, but there is a lively civil society in Afghanistan and advocacy groups and all that. But what donors can't do is when the government doesn't perform, somehow donors can substitute for that, because that totally is off base. And frankly, on aid coordination, the Afghan government is the only one that can do that. And the deterioration and churn in the Ministry of Finance, which I wrote about publicly early this year, is really concerning in that regard, because the Ministry of Finance is a linchpin institution in the Afghan government, which I would argue in previous years, including when Ashraf Ghani was finance minister, was functioning, was improving the situation. So sorry for a couple of different points.
Thank you for this. Let me second you on that. If donors are serious about accountability in Afghanistan, make the government accountable to the people. That's where you will see significant improvements. And I think that is something that the government has been pledging on that. But Mr. Muybe, quickly, the question for you is, where do you see which areas within the Afghan economy you see COVID and also this lack of Geneva or less pledges at the Geneva conference impacting which sectors mostly? Can you elaborate that question for me, please?
If you look, the COVID-19 impacted all sectors, especially the private sector was damaged more than the other sector. So what we are expecting, if the donors' commitment is reducing in the Geneva conference than the normal one, probably there will be mostly the infrastructure will be affected, especially the infrastructure in the transport and energy sector, because in infrastructure there is a huge need for the resources that in the current situation, the Afghan government will not have money from their own resources to build the infrastructure and also maintain the infrastructure. If you look in the last few years, we built like 10,000 kilometers of the road, but it needs regular maintenance. So if there is a reduction in the donors' commitment, so probably this sector, the infrastructure sector, will be affected more, because for the health, education, and also for the security sector, we have the commitment, especially security sector up to 2024. So we have the commitment, and the financial responsibility will be gradually transferred up to the end of 2024, because then the current and the 2021 budget, we also took some responsibility from the NATO and also to the security sector donor, and we finance from our own domestic resources. So I think mostly the infrastructure sector will be negatively impacted if there is a reduction. But one other thing, we are accountable. We are accountable to the people, and we are also accountable to the donors as well. So what we are saying, we don't want to leave an excuse to the donors community that there is not a mechanism in the government of Afghanistan to implement or to spend their money in the right way and in the right places. That is why we are coming to them that let's channel not direct, don't give directly this to us. Let's channel this to one of those trust funds that you are managing, because those trust fund is not managing by the government, that is managing by the donors community. This is one. Second thing, if you look from the ARTF and World Bank, every year we have around $400 million for the incentive program. So what is the purpose of those incentive program? The donors community through ARTF coming to the World Bank that these are the problematic area in the government. Just let me give you an example. This year was like in the public investment that we said from the discretionary resources, that how that is discretionary resource should finance the investment project. So there was one of the benchmark that we have to prepare the regulation for the public investment that we did. Other was how to digitalize the payment system and revenue collection system. So these are the benchmarks. So whatever the donors community thinking that there is a weak area in the government or problematic or challenging area, so they are coming up with their proposal, and we are agreeing with them in the timeline with the specific output, and based on that they are giving that money to us. So if you look only this year, we had $600 million program with them, and we already, so like we are in the finalization stage to achieve those things. The 15th November is the deadline. We also have the same contract with the European Union, state building contract. So there is also a specific benchmark with them. So it means that from government of Afghanistan, there is flexibility. I'm not saying that we are perfect. Why the donors are here? Because we have the problem. So that is why they are here to support us. So we are flexible, and we are open to openly discuss those things with the donors community.
Thank you, Mr. Muybe. So I'm afraid we have to wrap it up. There are different, very interesting conversation and different discussions around different approaches and modalities. But maybe wrap it up around modalities, because I think whether COVID presents an opportunity to revise and revisit the modalities and approaches that have been taken and employed over the last 18 years, maybe we could take some concluding remarks around that. What are the 2 lessons learned that we have taken over the last 18 years, and does COVID present an opportunity, Geneva itself, to maybe revisit those modalities, 8 modalities, moving forward? I'll be personally very interested in that question. So quickly, Mr. Parto, yourself, Parto, and Lucille, Martin, and then Mr. Burt and Muybe.
Just very quickly, I mean, a lot of this talk about information sharing, coordination, collaboration, etc., is wishful thinking, particularly given what's already been said, that these things are easier said than done. What I do want to emphasize, though, is we seriously, as global citizens, but also as Afghans, have to think about some basic scenarios. What if there is peace? What if there is no peace? What will happen in the near future? Never mind the Geneva conference and all the rest of it, never mind notes of accountability. What do we need to think about seriously about the US pulling out of Afghanistan? I mean, even when we speak to donors, it's a little bit like having your head buried in the sand, that they have not even considered the possibility that the US may withdraw from Afghanistan and how that will impact their interest in Afghanistan and their pledge to continue support for Afghanistan. If I were to leave this conversation with one question, that is that. What will you do, other donors, if the US leaves?
Well, that's the key question. And I think there are discussions around that. So Mr. Burt, the floor is yours now. You're muted.
I was unmuted and then muted myself. Thanks. Yeah, this has been a very lively discussion, but going into areas, I mean, frankly, you know, the US troop withdrawal is a central issue. Maybe I'll just come, you know, we're talking so much about the international modalities and fine tuning and improving those. And my concern is that amidst the decline in aid, Geneva will also just reinforce endless benchmarking and box checking by the Afghan government without meaning, you know, what does it mean whether Tokyo, Brussels, or past Geneva performance targets have been met and the box is checked? Let's just look at the situation in Afghanistan. I would highlight, I mean, aside from, you know, the issue of troop withdrawal and whether, you know, how that is going to be handled in a responsible or irresponsible way, I imagine, you know, I can't predict. I think some donors will be more responsible, but if there are no troops there, it's a bit hard to be responsible in terms of continuing to provide aid. You know, I have no answer to the question about how aid will support Afghan national security forces if troops leave, right? That's a critical issue, right? If otherwise we're in 1992 when the Soviet Union collapsed, its aid to Afghanistan stopped and the military collapsed and went into a civil war. So I guess let me come back just to be balanced. I think the real sadness and problem has been in almost the last decade, but certainly since 2014, the Afghan government hasn't got its act together. I mean, I don't want to. I'm equally happy to blame others and donors, but you know, the striking situation of a national unity government in name only, and you know, no coming together, whether it's in, I mean, compared to COVID, I would argue that the issue of troop withdrawal and reducing aid is probably even more important. I'm not downplaying the COVID issue, but the government has not come together. The Afghan politicians have not come together, and the Taliban will, you know, make some deals with some and pick you off. And I'm, you know, so quite frankly, I don't know if civil society can make the difference, but this is a central problem in my view.
Thank you so much. My kid is here, so I have to quickly open the door. But Mr. Muybe, the floor is yours.
So just, I'm not a politician and security expert to comment on the withdrawal of the US forces and also the security issues. Just I'm a technical person, so my comment and response will be technical. So what we have learned from, like from the Afghan government, learned from this COVID-19 is two things. One, that we have to go from this traditional process and traditional governance to the digital governance and digital economy. Because if such thing is repeating, probably we have to be ready, because this time we were not ready at all. And we have to be ready for that one. This is one. Second, this shock, like this COVID-19, so probably other kind of shock will also come, and there will be no donor to support us in that case. So we have to be self-sufficient, so, and we have to work on that things, because the donor will not be with us for all the time. So we have to be ready for these two things. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists, to the authors, Magdalena, everyone else who joined us tonight. I think this was a very useful discussion, lots of questions, and that shows how the difficulty and the fragility of the juncture that we are at this difficult time in our history. The floor is now to you, Magdalena, to conclude. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you first, Timur, obviously, for the hard work in bringing us together in a very, very insightful, sometimes technical, a bit philosophical, but I think very enriching discussion that I have really enjoyed. We've also got great questions, and while I could enjoy this, of course, I didn't get to ask my questions, but if I want to leave you in I think your well-deserved evening, maybe I will address them as my takeaways. But again, first of all, thank you really a lot, everyone, for participating, the presentations, and of course the authors. The first point that goes to Said's question, because I think that was what hit me the most, honestly, when I read the report. And of course, we commissioned it with an intent, but of course, in such a scientific academic exercise, sometimes questions are answered that you didn't raise. And I think that's really an important section, is the reflection on the relationship between the donors, and FES is not a classical donors. We're somewhat stuck in the middle between regulations from Germany and accountabilities and interest that we have in Afghanistan. But I think what we got with COVID was a taste of what this post-withdrawal could look like, because a situation where we're not sure if we can operate on the ground, where a lot of internationals couldn't even physically enter the country or enter areas they want to operate in. How do you monitor under these conditions? And a similar situation, I think, will expect us, and is what discussed among other donors for civilian aid. Yes, there is a lot of commitment, credible commitment to ongoing support for Afghanistan civilian, but how does it actually function when there are no troops there to provide the stability and security that we got used to in the past 20 years? But I think this is something where creativity and reflection on our instruments, tools, and also work ethics, to be frankly, I think will be inevitable. And I think that is something that the report points out, but I think this is the thought process that we're looking forward when also funds are decreasing and priorities have to be set new. But that could also, in some cases, be a good thing. And this is, I think, something that I took away also from the very interesting remarks and very nice analysis from Mr. Muybe about the priorities that we're moving in for Geneva. For us as FAS, we are extremely interested in seeing how the basket of the market, as you described, and the private sector recovery can actually develop, because this is what we see as key for peace. Afghanistan's ability to employ Afghans, being it reintegrated fighters, former fighters, being it former refugees, being it the youth that wants to have a place in a good life in the future, as one point of the resilience. And I think the social justice and decent work ideas that we want to see, or we hope to see for Afghanistan, I think these will be what we certainly keep an eye on, where we also offer support wherever that's possible, being it to facilitate dialogue, but also, of course, to help with studies, research, and exchange. And with this small rant, but I had to be quiet for 90 minutes, so I just took this minute at the end. I really thank you again for enriching certainly my afternoon, for bringing us together and discussing this. I hope everybody stays involved on these issues and stays open to the exchange. And with this, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your evening, your day. I think, Mr. Burt, you have quite an exciting day ahead of you. And special thanks to all speakers and panelists and everybody who watched us today. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.